Do you remember when wives were told to stay thin, stay quiet, and even sprinkle salt into their husband's mouth just to keep the peace? From obedience disguised as love to beauty sold as survival, these were the rules of marriage. But the fifth piece of advice is the one that'll surprise you the most. Never disparage your husband, or let anyone else do it. Do you remember when magazines told wives never to criticize their husbands, not even in private? When a woman could lose her friends, her peace, maybe even her home, just for venting about the man she married? If you grew up flipping through Dear Abby columns over morning coffee, you can almost smell the ink-stained pages, the crisp newspaper folds, the faint hum of a kitchen radio murmuring in the background. You'd scan down to that familiar bold title, 10 Commandments for Today's Wives, and feel that strange mixture of comfort and quiet fear. Because Abby's words weren't just advice. They were scripture for a generation of women taught that silence was a virtue. In 1972, Abigail Van Buren wrote, "Thou shalt not nag, nor scold, nor disparage thy husband. Neither shalt thou permit thy mother, thy sister, nor thy neighbor to do so, lest thy days be shortened in the house which thy husband provideth for thee." The phrasing was clever, biblical, like something you could cross-stitch onto a sampler and hang beside the telephone. But underneath that polite cadence was a message that ran deep. Your husband's pride mattered more than your pain. The image is so vivid, it almost hurts. A woman in her early 30s, apron dusted with flour, standing by the sink as her mother calls to ask how things are going. She smiles softly, lies through her teeth. "Oh, everything's fine, Mama," because somewhere in her head she hears Abby's warning, "Lest thy days be shortened." As if gossiping about your husband could summon divine punishment. As if being honest about your unhappiness meant you didn't deserve the home he provided. The context of that advice reveals everything about the early 1970s. Divorce rates were climbing, the feminist movement was rattling traditional values, and mainstream America was terrified that the domestic order might collapse. So women were told to swallow their anger, to smile through exhaustion, and to protect their husband's reputation like it was a fragile glass figurine. It wasn't about love. It was about loyalty to an institution that demanded silence. And that silence came with a cost. It cut women off from one another. You couldn't confide in your sister about his temper. You couldn't tell your mother he'd been drinking again. You couldn't even joke about his bad habits without feeling guilty. You were the public relations manager for your marriage, and the brand had to shine, no matter how miserable you were behind closed doors. Contrast that with today. Imagine telling a modern woman that she should never criticize her partner, not even in private conversation. She'd laugh, or maybe she'd bristle. Because now, emotional honesty is part of how relationships survive. Therapy, open communication, boundary setting, these are the things that keep couples strong today. Back then, secrecy was seen as stability. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many marriages looked perfect from the outside but were quietly suffocating behind lace curtains? How many women mistook endurance for devotion because a newspaper column told them to? And here's the real question. If you'd been there, in that moment, sitting at your kitchen table with that paper in hand, would you have believed it too? Abstain from vices to stay in the home your husband provides. Do you remember when your worth as a wife could be measured by the contents of your pantry or the number on your bathroom scale? When even your body was treated like a house your husband let you live in, rent-free as long as you took care of it exactly the way he liked? In that same 1972 Dear Abby column, right after telling wives to keep quiet, came another commandment that sounds harmless at first, almost like health advice. "Thou shalt not defile thy body, neither with excessive foods, tobacco, nor alcohol, that thy days may be long in the house which thy husband provideth for thee." The phrasing is elegant, almost poetic, but the meaning? It's a warning wrapped in lace. You could lose your place in the home he provideth if you let yourself go. Picture that world for a moment. You, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in a cotton slip, the faint scent of Pond's cold cream and cigarette smoke still clinging to your hair. The bathroom scale is metal, heavy, with a dial that creaks as you step on it. You squint down, holding your breath, praying it hasn't moved. Because if it has, if it's even 2 pounds higher, then you already know what the magazines will say. Be careful, dear. Men notice these things. That's how it worked. Women's magazines in the 1970s were obsessed with control. Diet control, beauty control, emotional control. The cultural backdrop was full of mixed messages. The feminist movement was teaching women to own their bodies, while diet culture was teaching them to shrink them. And the language of religion was the perfect disguise for that contradiction. Abby's "thou shalt not defile thy body" wasn't about health. It was about obedience dressed up as virtue. The cruelest part was how it twisted self-care into self-surveillance. You weren't encouraged to eat well or quit smoking for your sake. You were doing it to keep your husband happy, to remain desirable, to stay safe under his roof. That thy days may be long in the house which thy husband provideth for thee. As if your marriage was a lease agreement, and your body was the security deposit. Women internalize that message deeply. You can find echoes of it everywhere, from the rise of Weight Watchers meetings in church basements to the endless stream of reduce without effort ads promising husbands approval as the real prize. The slogan wasn't be healthy, it was be kept. Stay small, stay sober, stay spotless, so you can stay married. It's heartbreaking when you think about the psychology behind it. You start to see how shame was used as a leash. Gain weight? That's gluttony. Smoke a cigarette? You're defiling yourself. Have a glass too many at dinner? You're a bad example. The moral weight of purity was shifted from the soul to the body, and that body, you were told, didn't even fully belong to you. It belonged to the man who provided the roof above your head. Now, imagine applying that idea to today. Imagine telling someone, you should stay thin and pure so your partner keeps loving you. It sounds absurd now, because today we talk about mutual respect, health as empowerment, and love as a choice, not a contract. But back then, even women who knew better often played along, because disobedience came with real consequences: divorce, gossip, social exile. Still, let's be honest, some of that mindset never really went away. The language changed, but the pressure stayed. It's no longer, lest thy days be shortened, but you still hear its modern cousin: keep yourself up, or he'll lose interest. Different decade, same fear. So here's the thought I can't shake. What would it have felt like to truly believe that your body was a kind of holy space, but not one you owned? A place where your husband's comfort decided whether you were blessed or forsaken? Would you have followed that commandment just to stay safe in the house he provideth for thee? Men prefer thin and rich wives over fat and poor ones. Do you remember when Cosmopolitan told women that the secret to love wasn't kindness or compatibility, but the perfect ratio of dress size to bank account? When an entire generation of women were taught that being lovable was something you could calculate, like a shopping list: thin, check; rich, check; therefore, worthy. It was 1974, and Cosmopolitan was the glossy, glamorous gospel of the decade. Under Helen Gurley Brown, it looked modern. Bright colors, cheeky headlines, all the language of liberation. But in its pages, buried under lipstick ads and advice columns, came a line that summed up the cruel paradox of that era. Given the current cultural standards, a man would generally prefer to marry a woman who is thin and rich, rather than fat and poor. It's easy to laugh at that now, but back then, those words landed like truth. You could almost feel the panic they stirred in women's bodies. You'd flip through that issue in the waiting room at the beauty salon, the scent of Aquanet and hot curlers hanging in the air, and feel that quiet sting: thin and rich. The unspoken message was simple: your value was a sliding scale, and someone else held the ruler. This wasn't just about attraction, it was about survival in a shifting world. The 1970s were messy. Women were entering the workforce in record numbers, yet the cultural narrative still whispered that your ultimate success was marriage. And marriage, according to Cosmo, was an economic exchange disguised as romance. You could have brains, humor, compassion, but without the right body and the right wardrobe, none of it mattered. Let's pause and picture that world again. You're standing in the fluorescent aisle of a department store, flipping through hangers of polyester dresses, each one labeled with a number that suddenly feels like your future. A 6 meant you were safe. A 10 meant you had work to do. Anything higher? That was a warning label. The mirror in the dressing room wasn't just reflecting your shape, it was reflecting your social standing. The magazine took it further. In the same section, Cosmo printed a chart ranking female types: thin and rich at the top, fat and poor at the bottom. No irony, no disclaimer, just a hierarchy of desirability that told women to diet, hustle, and marry upward. Because being loved wasn't enough. You had to be envied too. What's wild is how Cosmo sold this as empowerment. Helen Gurley Brown famously said, "A woman with a good figure and a good job doesn't need to apologize to anyone." But the message underneath was never be free. It was be desirable enough to afford freedom, a subtle but devastating difference. Women were told they could have it all, but only if they looked the part. That contradiction sat at the heart of 1970s womanhood. The second-wave feminist movement was telling women to define themselves beyond men, while pop culture quietly whispered that none of that would matter if you weren't pretty. And not just pretty, the right kind of pretty. White, thin, wealthy, groomed. Magazines sold the illusion that happiness was a product you could buy off the rack at Bloomingdale's. What makes this advice so shocking now isn't just the bluntness, it's the way it seeped into the bloodstream of everyday life. Diet pills were marketed like candy, fashion spreads preached deprivation as discipline, and women learned to see their own reflections as a kind of performance review. But the strangest thing? Even women who rebelled against it, who mocked those charts, who rolled their eyes at thin and rich, still felt its pull. Because that kind of message doesn't vanish, it burrows in. It becomes part of how you measure yourself without realizing it. Today we talk about body positivity, inclusivity, self-worth divorced from appearance. And yet, somewhere inside, a quiet echo still lingers. Wouldn't life be easier if you were just a little thinner? A little richer? It's the same ghost, just wearing new clothes. That's the genius and the tragedy of advice like this. It was framed as harmless observation, a mirror held up to society. But really, it was a weapon disguised as wisdom, teaching women to compete, to conform, to chase a perfection that kept moving. So here's the question that lingers like perfume from another room. If Cosmo had told you that love depended on your waistline and wallet, would you have believed it? Or would you have smiled, closed the magazine, and dared to think that maybe love was something you didn't have to earn? Trick a snoring husband with salt in his mouth. Do you remember when marriage advice sounded less like partnership and more like espionage? When women were told that the secret to a happy home wasn't honesty, but stealth? It sounds absurd now, but in 1974, Cosmopolitan printed one of the strangest tips to ever appear in a mainstream magazine. It read, "Keep a salt shaker on the night table. When he begins to snore, carefully shake a few grains of salt into the corner of his mouth. The taste will make him turn over without really waking up. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it. The dim bedroom light casting soft shadows over floral wallpaper, a tired woman lying awake while her husband snores beside her. The rhythmic rumble fills the dark, the kind of snore that vibrates through the mattress. She glances at the nightstand. There it is, the salt shaker, waiting like a secret weapon. She reaches over, heart pounding, careful not to wake him. Just a pinch of salt. A few white grains fall between his lips. He stirs, mumbles, rolls over. She exhales in victory, half relieved, half ridiculous. It's comic and sad all at once, because beneath that bizarre image is something painfully familiar. The idea that women should fix their discomfort silently. That instead of addressing a problem, whether it's snoring or resentment, they should find clever ways to manage it without confrontation. That single piece of advice, printed with a wink and a smile, captured a much bigger truth about the era's gender dynamic. Wives were expected to be caretakers, peacekeepers, household engineers who solved every annoyance invisibly. A good marriage, according to magazines like Cosmo, wasn't one built on communication. It was one maintained by strategy. But think about what that really means. If your husband's snoring keeps you awake night after night, the healthy thing to do is talk about it, right? See a doctor, try earplugs, sleep separately if you have to. But in the 1970s, that kind of honesty risked being labeled nagging. A woman who spoke up too much about her husband's flaws was seen as ungrateful. So the workaround became salt. Literal salt in the mouth of a sleeping man. It sounds laughable, but it reveals something deeply serious. Women were being taught to solve problems without power. Every trick was a symptom of voicelessness. If you couldn't ask for what you needed, you found ways to get it without asking. And magazines rewarded that behavior with cute language, calling it clever, feminine, resourceful. You can almost hear the cultural script behind it. Don't make a fuss, don't wake him up, just handle it. And handle it she did, by choking her husband with condiments. What makes this advice especially haunting is how normalized it was. Cosmopolitan published it alongside makeup tutorials and romantic quizzes, as though sneaking salt into someone's mouth was just another household hack. It was never treated as strange. That's the part that tells you everything. Because underneath the humor, there's a kind of loneliness there. A woman lying awake next to a man she can't talk to, managing him like one more household appliance that occasionally malfunctions. She's expected to smile about it, to be grateful she has a husband at all. And this, really, was the unspoken foundation of so much 1970s wife wisdom. The idea that love was a performance, that you should appear patient and charming, even while quietly resenting the man beside you. Contrast that with now. Imagine if a modern women's magazine printed that tip today. Social media would explode. People would call it out instantly. That's manipulative. That's unsafe. Just talk to your partner. We take it for granted now that emotional honesty is a right. But in the 1970s, silence was survival. What's fascinating is how magazines like Cosmo dressed submission up as sophistication. They called it tact, elegance, emotional intelligence. In truth, it was damage control. Women learned to outthink rather than outtalk their husbands because talking got them labeled difficult. And yet, doesn't part of that still exist today? How many times do women still say, "It's not worth the fight," or "I'll just handle it myself"? That instinct, passed down from those decades of sugar-coated submission, still lingers like perfume on old fabric. So here's the question that lingers in the dark, long after the snoring stops. How many marriages survived because women became experts at pretending nothing was wrong? And how many nights did they lie awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing that love shouldn't have to be this quiet? Suppress your opinions to avoid bossing your husband. Do you remember when women were told that silence could save a marriage? That biting your tongue wasn't just polite, it was romantic? When magazines insisted that if your husband strayed, if he flirted, if he humiliated you, the answer wasn't to confront him but to soften your tone. It sounds cruel now, but that was the norm. In March 1970, Ladies' Home Journal ran a story in its famous "Can This Marriage Be Saved?" column about a woman named Marilyn. She was 32. NML, her husband, had embraced the era's new idea of free love. He wanted an open marriage. She didn't. She wanted faithfulness, a home, stability. So she wrote in, seeking advice, maybe compassion. But the verdict she received was staggering. The counselor concluded, Marilyn must learn to hold her tongue. She has been bossing and manipulating her husband for years. If she mends her ways and becomes more submissive, he may return to traditional values. Read that again. Her husband cheats, and she's told to apologize for being too assertive. That was the emotional climate of the 1970s, where a woman's voice was so dangerous it could drive a man into infidelity. You can almost picture her, sitting at the kitchen table with that magazine open in front of her, a mug of instant coffee going cold beside her, the house too quiet, her hands shaking just a little as she reads those words over and over. Hold her tongue, more submissive. You can see the way she presses her lips together, as if practicing silence right then and there. That column wasn't fringe. It was one of the most popular in America. Millions of women read it each month, hoping to find comfort or guidance. But what they got, more often than not, were instructions in self-erasure. Be patient. Don't nag. Let him lead. The formula was clear. The husband's behavior was a given. The wife's behavior was adjustable. It's eerie how systematic it was. These weren't isolated pieces of bad advice. They were part of a cultural operating system. The message appeared everywhere, in print ads showing women serving their husbands dinner with a smile, in sitcoms where the punchline was always, "The wife talks too much," in sermons, in guidance counselors' offices, even in marriage manuals disguised as psychology. A woman's opinion wasn't just unwelcome, it was dangerous, a spark that could burn the whole house down. And the cruel irony? Women believed it because they wanted to believe in marriage. They wanted to believe there was a fix, that if they could just be better, kinder, quieter, gentler, they could hold their lives together. So they tried. They apologized when they weren't wrong. They smiled through betrayal. They swallowed their instincts. In the "Can This Marriage Be Saved?" column, the counselor framed Marilyn's pain as overreaction. Her husband's free love was just experimentation, they said, a symptom of the times. But her sadness, her yearning for monogamy, was control. The professional advice, printed in a national magazine, was to fake agreement with his open marriage until he came around. Can you imagine? Pretend you're fine while your heart is breaking just to lure him back. That's not advice. That's psychological gymnastics. What makes it even more tragic is how familiar the emotional logic still feels today. Think of every modern article that says, "Don't be too needy, don't scare him off, play it cool." It's the same message, softened and rebranded for a new century. Suppress yourself to stay desirable. But in the 1970s, that suppression was a survival skill. Feminism was on the rise, yes, but not every woman could afford to join it. Many were still financially dependent on their husbands, trapped between liberation on TV and submission in their own living rooms. The magazines became mediators, telling women how to exist in both worlds at once. Smile like a liberated woman, but act like a dutiful wife. You can almost hear the counselor's voice in that Ladies' Home Journal office, calm and certain, telling Marilyn that her marriage could still be saved if only she'd learned to stop being herself. And you can almost feel her sitting there, shrinking inside her own body, wondering how something as natural as wanting loyalty had turned into a character flaw. That's the part that still stings. Because for every Marilyn, there were thousands of women reading her story and thinking, maybe that's me too. Maybe I am the problem. Maybe if I just stay quiet, it'll all go back to normal. And so they stayed quiet. Decades of silence packaged as devotion. Contrast that with now, where couples therapy encourages both partners to speak, to name feelings, to rebuild trust through honesty. It feels like progress, but it also feels fragile, because the echoes of that old advice still live deep in our collective memory. You can hear it in every woman who says, "I didn't want to seem crazy," or "I didn't want to nag." It's a script that never fully died. It just changed its tone. And maybe that's the final heartbreak of the 1970s marriage myth. That love wasn't about two people growing together, but about one person learning how to disappear gracefully. So, if you were Marilyn, sitting there with that magazine and that impossible advice, would you have stayed quiet? Would you have swallowed your words just to keep your marriage alive? Or would you have done the unthinkable, spoken up, even if it meant losing everything? Looking back now, you can see how those words shaped generations. A simple line from Dear Abby about not disparaging your husband taught women to silence themselves in the name of respect. A playful verse about not defiling your body turned health into obedience. Cosmopolitan's hierarchy of thin and rich over fat and poor disguised cruelty as ambition. Even that absurd salt trick, the one about sprinkling grains into a snoring husband's mouth, showed how women were trained to manage discomfort instead of confronting it. And Ladies' Home Journal's advice to hold your tongue in the face of betrayal? It reduced self-respect to a nuisance, something to be trimmed for marital peace. The common thread was clear: keep him happy, no matter what it costs you. But here's the thing about history. It never really stays in the past. Pieces of that conditioning are still with us. Every time a woman apologizes before sharing an opinion, or starves herself to look good for someone else, or swallows hurt to avoid a fight, she's echoing those same commandments dressed in modern clothes. The language has evolved. Self-care instead of submission, compromise instead of silence. But the emotional choreography hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe. And yet, there's something profoundly human about revisiting these old words now, because the act of remembering them, of calling them out, is its own quiet rebellion. It's a way of saying, we see it now. We see how absurd it was, how much it stole, how it shaped our mothers and grandmothers, and how we've spent decades unlearning it. That's the power of nostalgia when you look at it honestly. It's not just about the colors of the kitchen tiles or the jingles on the radio. It's about recognizing what those details hid, the tension between comfort and control, between love and loss of self. So maybe the best way to honor those women isn't to laugh at the absurdity of their advice, but to thank them for enduring it long enough for us to recognize the truth. And maybe tonight, as you scroll through your own feed, surrounded by a different kind of advice, hashtags about how to keep them interested, how to stop overthinking, how to be enough, you'll hear those echoes and smile, because you'll know better now. You'll know that love was never meant to be earned through silence, obedience, or sighs. It was meant to be shared, freely, honestly, and without salt. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.